If you're over 60 and thinking about selling your home, whether it's to downsize, retire, or relocate, this video is going to walk you through everything you need to know to do it right. Some things we're going to cover in today's video are capital gain tax rules and how to keep more of your equity. This is probably the biggest one that I see sellers get wrong, so I want to make sure you fully understand it. We're also going to talk about what buyers expect today because it's not what it used to be. In addition to that, we're going to talk about which updates actually make you money and which are a waste. We're going to talk about how to sell and buy at the same time without losing sleep. And lastly, we're going to cover the biggest mistake that sellers over 60 make that can cost them thousands of dollars. The very first thing I want to start discussing in today's video are capital gains taxes in 2025 and what you need to know. See, the old rule was that rolling your equity into your next home, you could avoid taxes. But here's the thing, that's gone. One of the very first things I do when I sit down with a seller, I ask them if they understand capital gains taxes. And what I'll tell you is most sellers get it wrong because they remember the old rule. See, the old rule was that if you rolled all of your equity into the next home, you avoided taxes. So if you had this big gain on your property, if you took all of that money and used it as the down payment on the next property, then you didn't have to pay any taxes. But here's how that's changed. Now, the IRS lets you exclude up to $250,000 in profit if you're single or $500,000 if you're married. See, here's the thing. You've had to live in that home 2 of the last 5 years as your primary residence. Let's say you bought your home for, say, $50,000 30 years ago, and today you're selling that property for $1 million. Well, that's a $950,000 gain. And the way the old rule worked is if you took that $950,000 and you rolled it into the next property, then you didn't have to pay any taxes. But the biggest difference today is that if you're married, you can only exclude $500,000 of that $950,000 gain, which basically means that $450,000 is potentially taxable. And as you probably know, federal capital gains tax can range anywhere from 0 to 20%. And many states like California add an additional 9 to 13% on top of that, which means of that $950,000 gain, you're maybe walking away with 2/3 of it. But with that said, it's really, really important to understand that you can reduce that tax bill by increasing the cost basis, which includes things like major home improvements. You know, if you repaired the roof, the HVAC, you did a kitchen remodel, any sort of improvements you've made on that property can essentially be added to that tax basis, along with things like closing costs, which include things like commissions, escrow fees. All of that can be added to the cost basis so that you can reduce your tax liability. So using that same example, you bought your home for $50,000. It's now worth $1 million. That's a $950,000 gain. But because you're married, you're able to take away $500,000 in tax-free gain based on the new capital gains laws. But let's say, for example, over that 30 years, you did a roof replacement, kitchen remodel. You repaired everything in that home. And let's say you spent $400,000 over that 30 years improving that home. In addition to that, you're going to have to sell that property, and you've got commissions and escrow fees and all of that you're paying. So when it's all said and done, let's just say that you have another $500,000 that you can add to your tax basis. Well, in that case, you could walk away from selling that home and not having to pay any taxes. But here's the key. You need to keep receipts. Make sure you work with a CPA or tax advisor before you list, not after you're in escrow. That's one reason that I have this conversation up front with sellers, is so that they know what they're going to be working with when they sell that home. The last thing you want to do with a seller is list your home, go under contract, and then find out that you're not going to have nearly as much money after the sale of that home as you originally thought. Now, I think it goes without saying, I'm not a tax professional, and you need to make sure you're working with one so that you fully understand the law. But one thing I like to do as a real estate agent is when I sit down with my clients and have this conversation, I like to get them something called a seller net sheet that shows them exactly what they would walk away with when they sell that home based on a certain sales price. That way they can take that document to their CPA and have that conversation to figure out whether or not it actually makes sense to sell that home. Now, before we go into section 2, I want to take a minute here and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, make sure you hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Now, the next thing I think it's important to understand is that the market has changed, and so have buyer expectations. This isn't the market from 30 years ago. It's not the market from 10 years ago. In fact, it's not even the same market as a year ago. Buyers today want clean, updated, move-in ready homes. They don't care how long you've lived there. They care what it looks like in the photos. A lot of them want to see neutral paint, consistent modern flooring, decluttered spaces, cleaned kitchens and bathrooms, and curb appeal that feels warm and updated. Now that doesn't mean you need to run out and do all of these improvements to your home. A home with really good bones in today's market, if it doesn't have all of those things, can still fetch top dollar, especially when it's in a really good neighborhood. And the reason I want to point this out is because millennial and Gen Z buyers, they grew up online and they judge listings in seconds. So as a listing agent, I think it's important to help you understand that you want to make sure your home looks like something they'd see on Zillow or even Instagram, not something they need to update themselves. Now I know what you're thinking, well, my home is older. There's a bunch of stuff in here that's been here, for 10 years, 15 years that needs to be done. And now does that mean I need to do it before I sell my home? In some cases, the answer may be yes. In some cases, the answer may be no. And the reason I say that is because as a seller, you live in your home. There are things that have bugged you in that property probably for a very long time. And in your head, you think those are things that need to be done before you sell your home because the next buyer, well, that's what they're going to be concerned with. And in some cases, you might be right. But what I'll tell you from my experience of over 20 years in this business is most of the time you're not. Those are things that are important to you. Whereas the buyer, they might have completely different concerns than the things that you're thinking about. So before you do any updates on your home, make sure you talk to a professional real estate agent in your market, somebody that understands your local market, can guide you through what buyers are actually looking for so that you can focus on making improvements that will actually help you get top dollar and not focusing on things that buyers are likely to change anyway. Now with that, I've created a list of vetted real estate agents that work exactly like I do, regardless of where you are in the United States. I've been doing this 20 plus years and I network often with a lot of top professionals. So if you need somebody that understands the business like I do and can guide you through that process, make sure you check that link in the description. Now, while we're on the topic of improvements and updates, I want to talk about the 3 updates that actually matter and the 2 that don't. See, in my opinion, paint and flooring can transform a property. I say it all the time. I sold a ton of foreclosures after the great financial crisis back in 2008. And one of the very first things we would do when we came in a property is we would paint and we would replace the flooring. It would absolutely transform the way that property looked. And that's why I do want you to focus on paint. Paint is not that expensive. In fact, it's probably the update where you get the biggest return on your investment, probably close to 100%. So with that, I want you to stick with light, neutral tones. If your home has a bunch of big, bold colors throughout, painting it one neutral color like white can go a very long way because white helps open up the room, makes them feel bigger, makes it feel a lot lighter and brighter. In addition to that, I want you to focus on flooring. Now, you don't need to go replace all of the flooring in your house, especially if it's in good shape, but I do want you to replace worn carpet or stained carpet or flooring that's completely outdated. You can go with something like a vinyl luxury plank, or in some cases, you can replace that carpet with like carpet where it just looks a little better. Now, one thing I will say about doing improvements is that if you have a house that needs a lot of work in all of the areas, replacing things like paint and flooring is not really going to go a long way because a buyer is going to walk in and think that they need to do all of these other improvements anyway, and so they're probably going to rip out the things that you're doing. But if your home shows well overall, and there's just some little things that you need to do like paint and flooring, then those 2 things get a really high return on investment. But I want you focusing on replacing things if there's a lot bigger projects that need to be done anyway. But the last thing I want you to think about is curb appeal. Remember, you only get one time to make a first impression. And one of the very first pictures that buyers see online is the exterior of your property. So you really want that property to show well, but it should also match what buyers see online. Don't just have a photographer take a really good photo of the front and use all of these different filters where it doesn't actually look like your home, because when the buyer shows up, if it doesn't look like the same house, they're going to know. So I want you to focus on fresh mulch, trim the hedges, power wash the driveway, the front of the house, maybe paint the front door. Remember, the buyer is going to be standing on your front porch as the agent fiddles with that lockbox trying to get in. And one of the things they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking around your property. So you want to make sure you don't have a bunch of deteriorated wood, you don't have a bunch of cobwebs, it's clean. And this is one of those improvements that you can get away with by just spending a couple of $100. Now, with that said, there are two things here I don't want you to focus on if you're getting ready to sell your home, and that is a full kitchen remodel. Spending 25, 30, 50 grand on your kitchen is not going to get you the same return on investment. In fact, it's probably going to get you somewhere around 50% if you're lucky to even recoup half of it. In addition to that, you don't need to spend a lot of money upgrading your bathrooms either. Just make it clean and functional. Yes, kitchens and bathrooms do sell homes, but only when they're done the right way. If you're just spending a little bit of money here and there, trying to get a quick fix so that it stands out, but everything else in your house needs to be done, well, guess what? Buyers are going to see right past, so I'd rather you save your money and focus on what buyers actually want. See, buyers don't want perfect, they want clean, they want livable. So with that said, you don't need to renovate, just refresh the property so that it appeals to the most amount of buyers. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is if you're selling and buying at the same time. This is one thing that sellers have a very hard time understanding, but it's something that's really, really common out there in the marketplace. So here's what I want you to do first. If you're planning to downsize or relocate after selling, it's really, really important that you do the following so that you can avoid stress. The very first thing I want you to focus on is getting pre-approved before listing that home. Even if you're buying with cash, you need to know what you can afford. The last thing you want to do is sell your home and then think you have X amount of money to go buy something else and realize, for one, that maybe you have to pay taxes on some of that gain like we discussed earlier, or maybe even that you can't afford what you thought you could afford because you didn't truly understand the pre-approval process, especially if you're getting a loan. So if you're getting financing, you need to confirm your income, especially if you're on Social Security or you're getting money from pension, retirement accounts, because the pre-approval process has changed a lot since you probably bought your home. So at the end of the day, you just want to make sure you know what you're working with. Secondly, you can also use a rent back. You can sell the home that you're currently in right now and then rent it back from the buyer for 30 to 60 days. What this does is it gives you time to find and close on your next home without rushing. What a lot of sellers are doing at the moment is putting their home on the market and then rushing to find something so they don't have to move twice. So maybe you're fortunate to find the right property and be able to put an offer in on it before you ever list your home or before you ever go into contract in your home. That's essentially ideal, but it doesn't always work out that way. So if you're in this stressful position where you're listing your home, you can't really find what it is you're looking for, one thing you can do is do that rent back. Or maybe even in some cases, you can sell your home contingent on finding a replacement property, which means you put your home on the market, you can accept an offer contingent on you finding something else, which again is very, very common in this market, assuming you're looking for something realistic. And then you can go out and try to find that right home, whether you're renting, maybe you're buying out of state, you're buying something, in another neighborhood. You can go out and make an offer on that other property, that down leg property if you're downsized, or maybe even an up leg property if you're moving up, contingent on selling your property. But it's important to understand that you have that home on the market, that you're not trying to buy something without ever listing your home, assuming you need the funds from that property in order to buy the other home. So this is important because it's one way to protect yourself so that you're not homeless when you end up selling that property. One other thing you can do is you can ask for a longer escrow. Most escrows today are somewhere around 30 days. While there's not a standard, I would say 30 days is probably the average. You can ask for a longer escrow. 45, 60, 90 days gives you a little bit more flexibility to align both transactions. But even then, if you don't have that property in mind, it can be stressful, so the contingent route might be the better option. And more importantly, I want you to know where you're going before you end up listing your home. Research neighborhoods, states, 55 plus communities, whatever it is, ahead of time. Have an idea of where you're relocating to so that you know how much those homes are. And that way, when you're selling your home and agent gives you that seller net sheet, hey, I have enough money to buy in this neighborhood, or maybe I don't. Maybe I shouldn't sell my property because I can't actually get what I was looking for. In addition to that, make sure you visit these areas in person. Don't just look at them online and then sell your home and then relocate and try to buy something. That's what a lot of people did during the pandemic, and a lot of those people have regrets. In fact, I have friends that sold their homes here in California, moved to Texas thinking that the grass was going to be greener, and then ended up coming back to California because it wasn't what they thought it was. So before you list your home, go out and look at these areas. Understand what's available in your price range so that you ultimately don't make a huge mistake. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the biggest mistake that I see sellers over 60 make, and that's too many sellers listing their home with no real plan. Like I've said, they have no no idea how much they'll net. They have no strategy for what to fix or leave alone. They have no clarity on where they're moving or how fast the process is going to take or how slow it's going to take for that matter. And what this does is it leads to last minute decisions, bad negotiations, and oftentimes canceled escrows. Now, if you're like most people over 60 that have owned their homes for a very long time, you've probably built some serious equity in that property. So treat this like the financial decision that it is, not an emotional reaction. If you've watched my channel for any period of time, you've probably heard me say this. Most people buy emotionally and they justify logically. The same thing can be said for sellers. A lot of sellers sell emotionally and then they justify logically. So I want you to avoid the emotional side of selling. If you've lived in your home for 20, 30, even 40 years, this isn't just a sell. I understand that. It's a life change. You're letting go of a chapter. You're dealing with emotions. And sometimes that makes it hard to detach emotionally from the value and the condition of your home. You've probably raised your kids here. In many cases, you've raised your grandkids here. And it's okay to feel that way. But what I want you to do is lean on your real estate professional to guide you with data, strategy, not emotion. Now with that, if you're thinking about selling in the next 6 to 12 months, make sure you reach out to me directly. If I can help you, I'll guide you through that process. If not, I'll refer you to an agent that can. One thing I like to do in that process is go over taxes, updates, pricing, and timing. You're going to leave that conversation with clarity and confidence. In fact, if you want to get in touch with me, please use that link in the description of the video. Now in today's video, we talked about more practical things for you as a seller that you need to focus on because the market's changed. But please realize, as a whole, the market is shifting and there are things that you need to be aware of. In fact, I cover them in this video right here.